What's up, guys? Nick Script from Fantrax here to talk waiver wire winners for fantasy football heading into Week 16. Let's start with the running back position. We have Ty J. Spears, if available, the rookie running back for the Titans. 10 touches in Week 15. He had 6 receptions for 89 yards in Week 14 for 17.8 fantasy points, 75 rushing yards in Week 13, 20 total touches that week, 4 weeks of double-digit fantasy points, 6 weeks of 4+ catches. Ty Chandler, if still available, he filled in for an injured Alexander Mattison in Week 15, and he carried the ball 23 times for 132 rushing yards and a touchdown, 3 catches for 25 yards, 24.7 fantasy points. You have to monitor Alexander Mattison's injury, but he could be in line to be the lead back again in Week 16. Another rookie running back for my Chicago Bears, Roschon Johnson, back in Week 12, played 74% of the snaps. He had 5 catches for 40 yards that week. In Week 15, he led the running back room again, playing 49% of the snaps, caught 4 passes again, and led in total touches. 4 weeks of 4+ catches, 3 weeks of double-digit fantasy scoring. Another running back who filled in for the lead back role was Zamir White in place of Josh Jacobs. We have to monitor Jacobs' quad injury, but he, again, could be a running back in line for some work in Week 16. 17 rushing attempts for 69 yards and a touchdown, 3 catches, 17.5 fantasy points for White in Week 15. Another rookie running back trending up is Chase Brown for the Bengals. Sure, he's a good handcuff to Joe Mixon, but he's getting some work here. Rushed for 61 yards in Week 13, 3 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown in Week 14, 3 catches again in Week 15. He just trailed Joe Mixon by only 3 total touches. Another guy, CEH, Clyde Edwards-Helaire for the Chiefs. Isaiah Pacheco may be back this week, but CEH might have earned himself some work. 17 touches in Week 15, 64 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown on 4 receptions, I think is significant. I think it almost pushes him ahead of McKinnon when it comes to pass catching, 20.1 fantasy points. Trey Sermon, another guy. We have to monitor what's going on with the Colts. We're going to pretend this M is actually an S, but Trey Sermon stepped in for an injured Zach Moss in Week 15, 17 rushing attempts for 88 yards. It's reported Zach Moss is hopeful to play, but again, it's news to monitor. Let's talk wide receivers now, starting off with Noah Brown of the Houston Texans. So he just had 8 catches on 11 targets for 82 yards and a touchdown in Week 15, 22.2 fantasy points. It was not the first big week for Noah Brown, though. He had 6 catches for 153 receiving yards and a touchdown and 27.3 fantasy points back in Week 9. And then the very next game, 7 catches for 172 receiving yards for 24.2 fantasy points in Week 10. So you've seen big days out of him. Joshua Palmer returned to the lineup. There was no Keenan Allen. We're not sure if he's going to even play in Week 16. And the quarterback situation, a little iffy, but Joshua Palmer caught all 4 of his targets for 113 receiving yards and a touchdown, 21.3 fantasy points. He's missed some time this season, but it's his 3rd week over 14 fantasy points. A lot of people ruled this guy out, but positive signs for Jameson Williams. So we've seen the yards per reception upside flashes this season. 2 catches for 53 yards and a touchdown in Week 6. 2 catches for 44 yards and a touchdown in Week 11. 2 catches for 51 yards in Week 12. He just caught 4 balls for 47 yards in Week 15. The significant no-throw from Week 15 was 7 targets. That's trending up. Another guy capitalizing on his situation is Dontavian Wicks. Christian Watson has been banged up. Jaden Reed might also be banged up, so we have to pay attention to that. But prior to Week 6, Wicks had 6 weeks of 40-plus receiving yards, 6 weeks of 14-plus yards per catch, 91 receiving yards back in Week 11. Then in Week 15, he caught 6 of 7 targets for 97 yards, 15.7 fantasy points, trending up in that offense. Zay Jones. This is a guy I like. Christian Watson's missing time. He's been targeted 8, 14, and 8 times across the last 3 weeks. So he's obviously had a bump in his usage. We have to monitor, though, because he may have a hamstring injury. The pivot in that offense would be rookie Parker Washington. Curtis Samuel doing things I wish Jahan Dotson was doing, but Curtis Samuel's doing it. 19-plus fantasy points in 2 out of 3 of his last games played. 12 and 9 targeted games during the span. 165 and 41 receiving yards the last 3 games played. He just had 2 receiving touchdowns in week 15. Another guy that can get a bump in his offense with some history of fantasy relevance is Tyler Boyd. Jamar Chase could miss time, which frees up targets, and Boyd has already earned 7+ targets in 7 weeks, 3 double-digit fantasy weeks. He's had a history of flex-worthy value through time, Tyler Boyd, in that offense, and Jake Browning's playing good football right now. Now we're looking at guys that are just getting targets. Jonathan Mingo, maybe is not translating to anything big for the rookie, but 4 receptions in 3 out of 4 of his last games played, 2 games of 60+ receiving yards during this span, 7, 6, 6, 10, 9, and 5 targets since week 10 is showing that they want to get their rookie involved. Another guy that just has earned targets and is also a rookie is Demario Douglas for the Patriots. 5 targets after missing some time just in week 15. Previously, week 7 through 10, before he missed time, 6, 7, 7, 9, and 9 targets. 6 weeks of 40+ receiving yards. Maybe he doesn't have massive upside, but he's earning targets, and in PPR leagues, that's what we're looking for sometimes. Same with a guy like Wan'Dale Robinson. Wan'Dale Robinson caught all 4 targets in week 15, 6 receptions for 79 yards in week 14 with 2 carries, 17.5 fantasy points. 3 weeks over 13 fantasy points this season. I think he's just the #1 target when it comes to the New York Giants. Demarcus Robinson's an interesting one. Going Robinson to Robinson here. He's interesting with the Rams as the wide receiver 3, 15.5, 13.6, and 14.7 fantasy points the last 3 weeks would have made him a good flex play, right? 3 straight games with a touchdown, 44+ receiving yards in these 3 games. It just kind of comes down to if it's going to be him or Tutu Atwell who's going to return from being banged up. Last really dart throw guy I'm going to throw out there is Treylon Burks, which a lot of people have ruled out too. 3 catches for 62 yards, back games with a carry. This was a guy that Tennessee invested a first-round draft pick in. A lot of people had hopes for him in the league. If he can find some more consistent volume behind DeAndre Hopkins, maybe he can have some fantasy relevance. Let's go down here for some tight ends. Tucker Kraft for the Green Bay Packers. He's playing in front of or for an injured Luke Musgrave, but he's excelling. He scored his 2nd touchdown in week 15 across the last 4 games, 54 and 57 receiving yards the last 2 weeks, double-digit fantasy points in both games. So Tucker Kraft is showing us some life there in the Packers offense. Another guy, quarterback situation's iffy, but sometimes I just like tight ends getting volume, and that's what Gerald Everett is doing right now. Back-to-back games with 8 targets, 4 weeks over 40 receiving yards. 3 of those were across the last 4 weeks. And then last, we have to monitor him because of the injury that he sustained in week 15. He's got a knee issue, but Hunter Henry, surprisingly, is back to life after taking too many weeks off, it felt like. But 19 fantasy points in back-to-back games, 3 touchdowns across the last 2 weeks with Bailey Zappi. So maybe that quarterback change gave him a boost. He just caught 7 passes for 66 yards in week 15. Good signs for a tight end. Quarterbacks now. Can we see all the way down here? Yes, we can. All right. Gotta talk about Jake Browning screaming at the camera, "You shouldn't have cut me." Quarterback 4 in back-to-back games, weeks 13 and 14. Top 10 quarterback in week 15. So that's 3 weeks in a row of him scoring 20+ fantasy points. That is better than being just a streamer. 354 and 324 passing yards in 2 out of 3 of his last games played. 7 total touchdowns across the last 3 games. Another guy who just went off, Baker Mayfield, if available. Season highs in week 15, 29 fantasy points, 381 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns. Prior to week 15, Baker had 6 top 12 fantasy finishes, 8 games throwing multiple touchdowns. It's 2023, and we're talking about Joe Flacco, who's actually looked really good. Back-to-back games over 300 passing yards. Back-to-back top 10 weeks with 21.3 and 19.9 fantasy points. 7 passing touchdowns across the last 3 games. Talking about a lot of backups here. Gardner Minshew, 20.6 fantasy points in week 15. He threw for 215 and 3 touchdowns. 4 weeks throwing multiple touchdowns. 3 weeks over 300 passing yards. And then last on my list, then again, we got to look at matchups when it comes to, streaming quarterbacks and picking them up. But we're just talking generally here. But Nick Mullins. Stepped in for the Vikings, 26 for 33 for 303 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, also had 2 interceptions, but 19.1 fantasy points. And if you look at the system, Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, and Nick Mullins actually had some very fantasy relevant performances back when he was a 49er in the past. So waiver wire winners, it always comes down to who's available, what you need, what the matchups look like, but hopefully you got something out of all this stuff. Good luck this week, guys.